Hello everybody, we're joined today by Izzy, the creator behind the BL webcomic REEDS. We had a really insightful discussion with Izzy, and to preview the episode, Izzy talks about his love for visual storytelling and how it has led him down the path of creating comics. Discusses the ongoing research he's done to create an accurate representation of Hmong people, and what it's like to see so many people interested in learning about it through his comic. He also shares his data-centric approach to growing his IP and his simple but effective philosophy of failing forward that we were really inspired by and are excited to share with you. Here's Izzy.
Hello, Izzy. Welcome to the show.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Why don't you give everyone a brief intro as to who you are?
Yeah, my name is Izzy. I go by ZZ Sleeps online. I am a Hmong American comic creator and I create the comic reads.
And what got you into comic making?
Started when I was very young. My dad was super into newspaper comics. So I
Mm.
got really into Peanuts. I got into Boondocks, Calvin and Hobbes, and a really big one for me was Gary Larson. So got really into the newspaper funnies and that divulged into anime and TV cartoons.
And from there, how did you get into making your own comics?
I've always preferred visual storytelling. So, my beginnings with drawing were more like memes and then a slice of life about myself. When I was in college, I did a lot of little mini comics about my experiences in college and going through the big city that I was in. So, comics have always just been a form of doing storytelling that people could see.
And jumping ahead a little bit to reads, if I remember correctly, you wrote out reads before you drew it out. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. I wrote out reads novel style, and I was not happy with the prose. I don't enjoy writing prose. So I opted to instead turn it into a comic because, again, I'm more of a visual storyteller, and there's a lot of things that you can do with visual storytelling and comics where you can have little subtle things going on in the background that people don't really notice. It's a lot more difficult to do that when you're doing it in prose. So it ended up being the medium that I preferred.
So when you started, it seems like you kind of had this idea and you're like, okay, I want to just get this story out there. Although you prefer a visual medium, you chose to go with prose to start. What was your process behind that?
So I remember you guys did a podcast with Plastic Audio, and they mentioned that their characters just kind of did whatever in their head, and they were the one that released it out to the world. And that's pretty much how it worked for me too. I just kind of sat down, and the words started flowing onto the
Hmm.
Google Doc. It's more like they do their own thing, and I'm the oracle that has to bring it into this mortal plane.
So how did you come up with the world and the story of Reeds?
I'm a really big fan of Chinese high fantasy, and my parents are too, and they got me really into it. But growing up, we watched a lot of like Chinese and Korean and Japanese dramas and high fantasies in their respective cultures, but never saw anything with Hmong culture because we're a very small minority group that a lot of people didn't know about until fairly recently when Suni Lee won the Olympics. So
Mm.
I wanted to create something that was like that, very high fantasy, very exciting, but something that I could see myself in and that other Hmong people could see themselves in.
When you were creating a story with Hmong culture as the spine of it, how much of it were things that you already knew? On your Instagram, it says that you are a Hmong comic artist. So I'm guessing you're drawing from a lot of personal experience. Were the things that you had to research and refine as well, just so you made sure you portrayed your culture the way you wanted it to?
Oh yeah, significantly. So I'm a second gen Hmong person in the US. My parents are 1.5 gen and their parents are first gen.
Mm.
So there was a lot of loss of culture as we gotten further down the generations because of assimilation and surviving in America. So
Mm.
there's a lot of things that I personally still don't know about Hmong culture that I end up reaching out to my parents or reaching out to other Hmong people. When I do research, I try and find as many resources as I can. There's actually a good handful of Hmong, I want to say teachers, but people who are, I guess they're teachers, but they release a lot of information about Hmong culture for people like me and also the generations coming after me who aren't as well versed as they would be in our culture. So
Mm.
there's a lot of Facebook groups that discuss different aspects of Hmong culture. But whenever I have a question, I always just message my parents and I'm just like, hey, like, what is this? How do I do this? Or like, does this sound right? That kind of stuff. So it's good to have other Hmong people as a resource.
How involved are they in the creative process, your parents? Because that's an amazing resource. I don't think I've heard of that yet.
Yeah. I didn't tell my parents about Reads until we hit around 7K subscribers. And I sat them down and I was just like, okay, this is a thing that's happening. And I try and keep them hands off from the storyline because my dad's kind of a backseat writer. But I do reach out to them as like a cultural resource. So, for example, the Hmong groups that are in the US, there's two different Hmong groups that are in the US. It's the white Hmong and the green Hmong. My dad is white Hmong and my mom is green Hmong. So there's
Mm.
different subtleties with each like subgroup that you kind of have to be aware of. So I talk with my dad and I talk with my mom about like, hey, there's this thing that I want to portray in my comic. Does it kind of align well with this? Or, there's words that are different because they have different dialects. So whenever I'm thinking about a word or a character's name, I'm like, okay, am I spelling this right? Or am I thinking of this in the right way? So that's pretty much the extent of their involvement. Otherwise, I get really embarrassed like talking with them about my comic. So whenever like a new episode comes up and they'll message me and they'll be like, I love the new episode. I'm like, great. I don't want to talk anymore about this because I'm embarrassed.
That's awesome. They're regular readers. That's the absolute best.
Yeah.
Is there something that you learned in the process of creating this comment? I'll admit I didn't know anything about Hmong culture until I read your comic. I read the Q&A and I was able to learn a lot more. So I appreciate you putting your story out there, gave me the opportunity to learn more. But was there something you learned that you didn't realize before as you created this comic?
Yeah, I learned that people are hungry to learn about other cultures. One
Mm,
of the bigger things that I've gotten feedback on about my comic is that, this is a lot of people's first introduction to Hmong culture. And people are very fascinated by that. They love learning about Hmong culture. And it's not just people who aren't Hmong, but also other Hmong people. As I mentioned previously, a lot of the
mm,
generations under me, they're losing a lot of our culture because there's a lot of things that come into it. It's like language barrier, Americanization is a really big factor into it. So there'll be things that I talk about in the comic, like superstitions or traditional practices that they didn't know were a thing. And they'd go to their parents and ask them, like, hey, is this a thing? And their parents be like, yeah, it's a thing. So the core learning that I took from it is that people want to learn more about other cultures and they're very hungry to learn about these cultures and they find these things fascinating.
one interesting thing about your comic is how you talk a lot about gender identity within the story. There's things that different characters are going through, and you also, I think, in one of the Q and A's talk about how Hmong culture views gender identity. I guess like, is that something you knew about before, and you're like, okay, I see a way how to weave these two things in together, or what was your process for like bringing that together?
Yeah, so the story itself was born from a really interesting time where I was still coming to terms with my own gender identity, having that transgender egg crack. So it was a lot of philosophical self meditations on reconciling with my culture as well as my identity. There was a point where I felt because we have a very rigid, binary, patriarchal culture that has very strict gender roles for your assigned gender at birth. So it was really difficult for me to reconcile, hey, is it possible for me to be LGBT? Is it possible for me to be transgender and also be Hmong? And so it took a lot of thinking on it and a lot of research into our traditional shamanism to kind of come to this conclusion that, yeah, it is possible. And it really surfaced. The plot line about gender identity in my story really surfaced when I was talking to my dad and trying to explain to him about what it's like to be transgender.
Mm,
And the way that I did it was I explained to him that I used terms that he would understand because I was talking about it in the sense of our culture and that my spirit, my soul isn't, matching up with the gender that I was assigned at birth. And that's when it clicked for him. That's when he was like, oh,
mm,
okay, I get that now because it's a part of our culture and these are things that we understand. So
mm.
that was another thing that I wanted to do too is that because there's a lot of queer Hmong kids who have reached out to me saying that, like, they really cared a lot about this comic because it's helped them. I wanted to be able to provide a way for people to understand the spiritual aspect of being transgender and being able to communicate that with their own family members.
It's one thing for you as an individual to go through figuring out your own gender identity. That must have taken just a lot emotionally, physically for you to be able to do that. It's another for you to then put that out there in a story. So, I mean, what was that like? And now you're hearing from other queer monk people. Thanks for putting this out there, and it makes me feel more at peace. You even say it in your Q&A. You want to comfort queer monk people. What was it like for you to go from like, okay, figuring out my own gender identity to creating a comic to then getting feedback from people that this is helping them?
Yeah, I mean, it was a shock. When I went into it, I wasn't really expecting people to really be reading it. When I grew up, my parents were also very skeptical of if people would be accepting of our culture. I remember my dad, because my parents they grew up 1.5 generation. in like the 80s and 90s, it was really difficult for them to kind of express who they were without like being associated with the larger East Asian groups. So my dad would
Mm,
always tell me, if you ever want to tell a story, you should have like a white protagonist because people will be more accepting of it.
mm.
But, people are able to relate to my characters, even though they're not white, and especially more so with Hmong people who do understand like the culture and the world that we're in. So it was a shock to receive that kind of feedback because, it shatters like that idea that I've kind of grown up with. Um, I I very much enjoyed being able to have that kind of impact on people. I actually had an in-person fan interaction fairly recently.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, it really solidified the reality of like, okay, this is actually touching people's lives and affecting them.
If you don't mind sharing, like, how did that like go down? Because I think one tricky thing for webcomic artists is like it can be hard to know, like, oh, this is like the creator of something that I love so much. Like, how did they realize it was you? What was it like? I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, it was so funny. I went to it was a Southeast Asian festival. Just
Yeah.
went on a whim, found out about it like the day before. There was a Hmong booth there. And so I had flyers for reads on hand and I shared it with them and I was just explaining like, hey, yeah, it's on Webtoon, check it out, tell your friends. And they were really nice and they were polite and they were like, oh yeah, cool. Like we'll be happy to support and tell everybody. And I walked around the festival for a bit and like about 15 minutes later, this woman from the booth came running after me. I introduced myself to her, so she was just like, "Izzy," and got my attention. And she told me, she was like, "I just found out that my little sisters are huge
Oh
fans of your
wow,
comic, and, like, they wanna meet you, and they're, like, running around looking for you." And so,
that's so
yeah,
cool.
I stuck behind, and I got to meet them. It was very eye-opening because I realized, just how young my, reader base kinda skews, but it was also very fun. I had a King keychain. It was one of the prototype keychains on me, and I gave it to them. It was great to just, yeah, get to talk to them and have that interaction. That's when I really like, receiving letters from people like, telling me like, how this has impacted them. It's very real to receive those. But this was like, I'm in real life talking to
Mm.
somebody about my comic. And that was where it really set in like, oh, okay, this is a thing that is happening because of my comic.
The keychains are going to be a big part of this pod. I have so many questions because I know that was a journey on its own for you to finally find someone who can make these keychains for you. But I wanted to talk about the characters first. I mean, you have such like a rich cast of characters. Like, how did you come up with them? And are there certain characters that you're like, yeah, I see myself, this part of myself in this character, maybe this part in another character? Yeah, let's just start with how you came up with them.
Yeah, yeah. There's three core characters. So the first main character is King. King is actually my dad's original character. My dad and I talk a lot. We both love stories, so we talk a lot about story ideas. We've talked about it a ton just in the car when I was growing up. So my dad had this idea that he told me he wanted a character who could control spirits using our traditional instrument, the king, which talks in the language of spirits. So the music notes that you hear from the gang are actual words being spoken in the language of spirits. So he wanted a
Mm,
character that was kind of like a Pied Piper that can control spirits or talk to them. And so that was the basis for King. And it's really funny because when I first designed King, he was supposed to be a very cold, ruthless, murdering type of character. But as I mentioned before, when I start writing, the characters kind of just take control and do their own thing. So he ended up being more of a sensitive crybaby. But people love him, and I do appreciate that too because I like that he's a very sensitive character. I have a little brother who he's very very sensitive, and
mm,
I wanted kind of that representation too. So I'm very happy he turned into that. The other main character is Shu, who I went in. I really wanted a prince character who was very naive about the real world, who was very sheltered and gets kind of introduced to the reality of things. And I wanted him to be very book smart rather than physically smart. But when I continued writing him, he ended up being really stupid. He's not the brightest character. He's very naive and very innocent. So they get into a lot of trouble because he's not very bright and he doesn't make very good
mm.
decisions because he's inexperienced. He's a very good character. And I actually find that out of all the characters that I have, I relate to him the most just because he has a very interesting internal world that I feel like I relate to. Yeah, and then the third core character is I don't know. I don't know if I should say his name because it could be a spoiler for people. But the third character is the transgender prince, the youngest prince, Shu's youngest brother, who goes through a journey of self-discovery realizes that there is a lot more about him that he didn't know previously. And he's unlocking a lot of the more darker secrets of the world that he's in and who he is as a person. Um, he's a very interesting character because I wasn't sure which direction I wanted to go with him. As he continued to write himself, he became more like a emotional shonen protagonist.
Mm.
So he's been very fun to work with.
And Shu is the one that you're like. It's funny that you say that you ended up writing him as not the most intelligent, and you're like, I relate to him the most. Are you like, damn it, why did you do such a stupid thing at this point in time? Do you ever feel that way as you're writing him?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he makes a lot of like really weird decisions, and he's also kind of impulsive. I find myself also impulsive and being like, "Oh, why did I make that decision?" So that's where he's relatable.
What about like the fantasy and action? Like, how did you learn and like craft that part? Because, it's one thing to talk about a character's individual journey. Getting action and fantasy elements are like, it can be really difficult too. Like, where did you draw from in order to pull that off in your comic?
Yeah. Um, to be honest, I was not very well versed in action. I love, again, Chinese high fantasy. I love like martial arts movies. And so action is something that I personally enjoy as a consumer. As a creator, I hate it. I really do
Mm,
not like drawing action scenes because they're very dynamic, but it's something that I have to learn because again, I don't control the story. So it's been fun though, learning a lot about foreshortening. What I've been doing to learn and understand action more is reading action webtoons because the way that you do action in a
mm,
scroll comic is different from how you would do action like on a page or horizontally.
yeah.
You have to be considerate of the reader scrolling upwards. You have to be considerate about the flow of your action. So I studied some other action webtoons just, on the front page of Webtoon, all their popular action comics and kind of figuring out, okay, what are the solutions that these creators are making to
Mm,
convey action with the limitations of the scroll format? And what are they doing to another thing is getting around censorship because that was a really big one for me. And also how they make their panels very dynamic and they're not doing one of the
mm,
pitfalls that I felt I was falling into was doing a lot too many standard motions. What are they doing to make each new panel more dynamic? So I learned a lot about how to use blur, what kind of shapes they're doing, what kind of angles they go for. Being very observant and studying action webtoon scroll comics has been very helpful for me.
You mentioned censorship earlier. Is there something in particular that Webtoon doesn't want you to have in the comic?
Yeah, so you have to follow the terms of service or the terms of use because Webtoon is a mobile app. So they have to comply with the terms of service and terms of use and the content guidelines for mobile with mobile marketplaces like Apple and Google Play. There's limitations on how much blood you can show, alongside things like nudity, suggestive content, how gratuitous the blood and the violence
I
and
see.
that is, yeah. Because again, it's mobile apps, so you have to comply with that kind of stuff. It's not that they want to censor you because they want to be mean, but that
Mm.
in order to keep operating, these are the things that they have to do.
On that note, I'm just curious, like, if there's no censorship, are you like I want more blood and gore in my comic? Are you like, given this story, this feels appropriate? I'm just curious, naturally, like where on that like kind of range you would want to be.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of gore, but I really like blood. I love like really dramatic anime blood splatters. Before I joined onto the Creator Awards program, I had a lot more blood in the comic that had
Mm,
to be censored in order to qualify. They actually like they took down my episodes before, and I had to fix them and get them cleared and approved. So I've been more mindful about the amount of blood because a lot of the issues came from just there's way too much blood, like in this, too much red. So it just kind of reduced
yeah,
it. I do find that censorship, it's fun to be creative with it too.
yeah.
And I also enjoy looking at how other people do censorship and studying the different artistic ways that they do it. There's an art to it, and I think that that should be appreciated too.
I don't know if you watch Rick and Morty, but they do some very creative. I don't know how like we can show some of the stuff that they pull off on TV, but they're very creative with it. I'll give them that.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? I feel like they do that a bunch in their episodes.
Mhm.
One other really impressive thing with your webcomic is the cadence of which you've been publishing this. So you started in 2020, it's going strong. You publish pretty much every week, and there are a lot of panels. I'm guessing it helps that you have a story that's been written. So, you at least have a general plan. But going from that to like publishing weekly episodes that are very, very deep is difficult. So, do you mind walking us through your weekly process of how you get panels and get your episodes out there?
Yeah, I have a very, I would say, strict schedule on how I allocate my work and my to my abilities, how I would allocate my work. So, I do have a day job, so I go to that. When I get back home, I allocate about 30 minutes to an hour for dinner and calming down after work, and then just kind of getting relaxed and figuring out, okay, what am I going to do for the rest of the night. There is a subsection of time after that between like a certain time and then another certain time to where I dedicate that to other hobbies or other interests so that
Mm,
I don't burn out on my comic.
mhm,
So that would go to like video games. I have a doll hobby, so I paint dolls. It could
mm,
go to watching like TV shows and movies. I'm currently watching Rings of Power with my husband, and it's been awesome. So I dedicate that time frame to doing something that just is completely not my comic. I have a shower at a very specific time of night. And then after that, after the shower, that's like the physical, like, cleaning off the rest of the day. After that,
mm.
the rest of the night is dedicated to working on the comic. And I don't force myself to hyperfixate on the comic and only do that for the few hours. I do try and encourage myself to take frequent breaks. So I'm on Twitter a lot. I'm watching a lot of YouTube videos. I will scroll through TikTok a lot. Um, but my mindset has to be that this is comic working time. I can take a bunch of little breaks in between it, but what I'm doing as the main event of that portion of my night is the comic. And so this continues on. I have the schedule from Wednesday to either it depends on when I finish the episode. So if I finish an episode really quickly, I'll take Monday off, but it'll go up to Monday and then I take Tuesday off to just kind of enjoy myself and enjoy like the new episode release. And it goes on like that.
This is not related, but have you seen Dress Up Darling? You mentioned you had a doll hobby, so I was just curious if that was something you enjoyed.
It's so funny because when that came out, everybody was telling me like, you have to get on this, because they know that I love dolls. I have not watched Dress Up Darling yet because I haven't set down the time to do it. But no, yeah, it's on my to watch list because it's pretty much everything that I like. I also really like Gyaro fashion and that kind of stuff too. So having like that kind of character interests me a lot.
Yeah, I'm not trying to get you off of your schedule or something, but it is funny to hear that. And let me know what you think once you end up watching it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So you've done this for 2 years. What have been your biggest learnings since doing this?
I've learned a lot about just scroll comics in general because I've never really worked on scroll comics before. Most of the comic work that I've done is it's either one panel or like very short, very memey. So I had to learn a lot about how to draw for one thing. I never took drawing very seriously until I started this comic. And you can kind of see it too when you read the first episode and you compare it to the most recent episode. You can see kind of the evolution of my drawing. So learning how to draw was the first thing that I learned. The second thing I
Mm,
learned was shortcuts and how to kind of get around things. Aside from like all the typical shortcuts of like using certain assets or reusing brushes, reusing like line art. Um, One of the things that I do is I kind of design characters to be a little more simple. I have a lot of characters who wear capes, so I can obscure a lot of their bodies with just the cape flowing.
mm,
People think it's really cool. It's just to
yeah.
cut time.
Did you like design the character? Your like capes are part of it, and then you're like, oh, they could be helpful, or did you add them later?
No, yeah, yeah. It was when I first designed like the royals and they all have capes, and I thought it was really cool. And then as I continued drawing them, I'm like, wait, I can just use the cape to like cover their body. I can use the cape as like a transition, so it helps a lot.
And you made a YouTube trailer for season 2. It blew my mind, like just like someone making a video trailer. Was that difficult?
Yeah. So the first thing that I did was put together a storyboard, or I wrote down an outline and then was working on the storyboard. But I reached out to voice actors first because I wanted to kind of feel out the voices of the characters. So I did a call for voice actors, and that was actually
Okay.
very overwhelming because it was my first time calling for voice actors. And it turns out there's a lot of voice actors, especially
Yeah.
on Twitter. And so like my DMs were really swarmed with voice actors, and I learned about the different values that voice actors have and how to work with them. I have a friend who is a voice actor. His name is G, and he helped guide me through the process of voice direction and communicating with the voice actors. So that was really cool. I dedicated a good portion of time to not only working with the voice actors on the lines that I gave them, but also working on the artwork for the comic, or not the comic, the video. And
Mm,
after we compiled those assets together, I also had a musician that I worked with, Raiko, who did the music. I kind of just gave her like some music that I liked that I felt would be a good vibe for the trailer and asked her, "Hey, can you like do something like this?" And she crafted together this. It was a really incredible theme song that I worked a lot of the storyboard around. And we
Mm.
brought all that together. My husband is a video editor, so he edited it all together, and that's pretty much how it came about. It was really, really cool just seeing it all come to life. You get all the little bits and pieces, and you can kind of like imagine like where it's gonna go, but you don't really see it until you have it like in that video editing room.
Mm.
And we're doing those little like little timing details and watching it over and over again. It's like, okay, this is like an actual thing that like we've created together. It's a really cool collaborative effort. I'm really grateful for everybody who participated in it.
I also like how you have your whole family working on the webtoon. Just props for making that happen. Like your
Yeah.
husband's editing, parents are like what's it called when like there's like a advisor for like a space movie, they'll have like NASA scientists. Like that's what your
Oh,
parents are basically for
yeah,
this
yeah.
one. I
Like
forget there's
consultants.
like a name for yeah, your parents are the consultants, cultural consultants.
Yeah.
Well, you're pulling it off really well. How did it feel to have that shared by webtoon?
Oh, yeah, well, it was, a standalone video for a pretty long time. Webtoon reached out to me, the Webtoon Canvas team, they're really great. I love working with them. I love Winnie, shout out to her. They reached out to me around the time when they were going to do promotions for, AAPI month, and they said, "Hey, is it okay for us to do a native post with your video?" And I said, "Yeah." And we only had to do, like, one small tweak where instead of saying, like, "Oh, it's like, season 2 out and in, like, December," because we were already past December, we just had to, like,
Mm.
kinda tweak it to be a little more general. But it was really cool. I really enjoy every instance that they have helped share my comic. I've been very grateful to the Canvas team.
You have over 30,000 readers now. I mean, how does it feel to have built such a big reader base?
Oh, it's great. It's definitely way beyond what I had anticipated when I started. I didn't go into it with any expectations. So I'm just really grateful that there's all these people who not only read it regularly, but are cool to receive notifications for it and keep up with it and be dedicated to it.
So you use social obviously to get the word out there and spread things. I've seen you've done things on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. Do you kind of think about like using social to help grow your audience, or how do you view each of those channels?
Yeah, so every social media channel has a different audience, I feel, a different demographic or different demographics within them. So for example, I avoid Reddit because it doesn't have the audience that I need. And so it'd be kind of a wasted effort to reach out on Reddit. But I utilize Twitter more for networking with other comic creators, being a part of the community, being aware of what's going on in the comic community and news. And also, most of my updates on Twitter are more like excitable updates for anyone who is a fan of Reeds who's following me. I can post like, sneak peeks, that kind of stuff, and also announce when a new episode has come out. That's mainly what I use that for. When it comes to Instagram, I actually use Instagram to target a Hmong audience because there's more Hmong people on Instagram than there are on
Hmm.
Twitter. So I craft the way that I make posts on Instagram to target Hmong Instagram users, as well as a younger audience who would align better with Webtoon, kind of introduce them in a very visual format, kind of show off my art a lot more, whereas Twitter shows off my personality. When it comes to TikTok, I'm still fairly new to TikTok, but I've been enjoying learning about its landscape, discovering that it has a lot of users,
Yeah.
and that's where you can pull a lot more traffic if you can successfully make a TikTok that kind of is a hit. Right now, the TikTok that is still running as a hit for me is one about how my dad keeps telling everybody about my comic, and he didn't even realize that it was considered like a BL until he actually read it. So that's still going. Like I still get I wake up every day and it's like 99 plus notifications on this one TikTok that I made
Oh
like
wow.
over a month ago. Yeah. And that has channeled significantly more users, more subscribers and more page views to my comic than Webtoon's internal marketing, for example. But I think that the biggest platform that has helped my comic grow is Webtoon itself. It has pretty good internal marketing when you get featured and promoted on there. And so a lot of subscribers that I've gotten now were because Webtoon recommended me to people or because they put me in like a spotlight section. So I would say that currently Webtoon is the platform that I rely on the most to kind of get the word out. But aside from that, I am looking towards TikTok as a means of funneling users to my comic. And if they like it, then they'll subscribe because TikTok right now has the demographic. Webtoon skews pretty young, so there's a lot of young people on TikTok who are also like using Webtoon. I don't think that the other avenues are places that you should give up on, but I think that right now we should turn towards TikTok as a means of user acquisition.
Is it easy for you to see as a canvas creator, like, oh, these are the people that have come from TikTok? Or are you kind of just looking at, oh, my subscriber base has grown by this much, my followers on TikTok have grown by this much, or I've gotten this many views? Like, how are you able to kind of bridge that gap?
Yeah, I have a spreadsheet where I keep track of subscribers and page views every day when it resets in our
Mm.
little like internal data tracking counter. Because they don't in on the Canvas end, they don't give us like a holistic view of our growth. They only give you
Mm.
the stats for the past 24 hours. So you kind of have to keep track of that. I've only missed like one day out of the 2 years that I've been on this platform. Um, but I keep track of that and I always put down notes of like, what did I do today that might have caused like a spike here or there? So, like, for example, if a TikTok goes off, then I can see there's a lot of traffic coming to my comic. I got a lot more page views. I got a lot more subscribers. And I'll put in a note like, oh, hey, like, this TikTok did well. So that's pretty much how I track that kind of stuff. If there's sometimes an influx of subscribers and page views where I can't trace down if I've done anything externally to cause that. I'm at a point now where I just kind of chalk it up to because Webtoon has a section for readers usually at the bottom of a comic that they've been reading where it's like, oh, if you like this comic, then you'll like this comic, that kind of stuff. I've kind of attributed to that where I'm pretty sure I'm showing up algorithmically to people more often on certain days.
Do you think there's anything that you've done that obviously, a big question we get and people have is like, oh, how do I get promoted by Webtoon more? Is there anything you think that you've done that has helped with that? I'm guessing it's really difficult to tell if that's the case.
I don't have any clear evidence on what makes them decide to reach out and promote, but I think that it's really beneficial to have content, social media content out there that they want to promote. And I can pretty much pinpoint each one that they've reached out to me to. I did a really long Twitter thread giving advice on webcomics, and they saw that. So they reached out to me and they were like, hey, can we share your Twitter thread, but like make it native and add our own graphics to it? And I was like, yeah, of course. So I think that, and again, too, with like the trailer and like another instance was I did an art to celebrate a subscriber milestone. So I think that if you have assets that are at the ready for them to utilize, they'll be more likely to reach out to you because, you
Mm.
have the assets or you're celebrating a milestone and they want to help share that too because, it's there and they can help get more eyes on it.
The other thing I wanted to touch on was monetization, supporting yourself as a creator. You mentioned you have a day job, but obviously a lot of creators are looking at how do I support myself with the comic that I make? The first thing is Patreon. You have over 20 patrons. What have you seen work for you as someone that's on Patreon?
Honestly, I'm very grateful. I'm also very shocked that people subscribe to my Patreon. I find that a good majority of the patrons are just genuinely wanting to support me, which I find I'm very, very grateful for, and I find very endearing. I really appreciate that, they want to support me, and they always tell me that they want to see me succeed. So I'm really grateful to them for that. The things that I offer on my Patreon are more behind the scenes looks, first looks at illustrations and merchandise. They got to vote on the t-shirt design, the layout for the
Mm.
t-shirt design, which is really cool. And I like that they get to be a part of that process. Other things like sketches. So these are like sketches that I don't feel comfortable sharing publicly. Just like,
Mm.
my quick warm-ups that I do in between panels. But I do like being able to share that fun aspect of having little rough sketches and sharing that exclusively with this group. Those kind of little things and, a little more intimate parts of reads is what makes my Patreon appealing.
You mentioned the suggestions and voting. You say that it's something that you kind of market on your Patreon. Do you see a lot of engagement with that? Because I can imagine that there's some of your readers who get really excited that they can kind of go behind the scenes in that way. Can you talk a little bit more about like how those suggestions and polls and things work?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the content that you're asking for a poll for.
Hmm.
For the most part, I've spoken with other people about Patreon, and Patreon's engagement rate is actually pretty low for users in general. People sometimes will even like leave your Patreon if you update too much because you're sending them way too many notifications. But
Mm.
um, for the most part, I feel like engagement is low, but the people who will vote or the people who will engage with your content will do it so consistently. So I always see the same names and the same faces, like returning and talking and commenting and voting.
And then on the Etsy side, you made over 100 sales, which is crazy. And maybe the best place to start is the keychain. Can you talk a little bit about why you wanted to create a keychain and what that process was like for you?
Yeah, this was actually my very first ever foray into merchandise. And I had no idea what I was doing because I'd never worked in print merchandise at all. It was a lot of learning. I've tried to pull around and ask people like what kind of merchandise do they like? And then I had to take into consideration my demographic as well. Cause I mentioned before I definitely skew more on the younger side. I think the majority of my readers are in their teens or they're young adults in college, so they don't have a lot of money to throw around. But people like keychains because it's small and you can put it on pretty much anything and kind of share that little like the little representation of yourself, this little thing that you like. So keychains were the first thing that were on my mind, aside from prints, which I felt like were more standard. And surprisingly, too, the prints sell very, very well. I was very surprised to see how many people wanted to buy prints because I personally don't buy prints that much. Yeah, the keychains, they're popular among young people, and so that's why I wanted to go with keychains.
And then you talked a little bit about the reception. What do you think was the secret to like the success of getting so many sales? Because I know for a lot of webtoon creators, it can be difficult to get sales on Etsy, but why do you think it's worked so well for you?
Yeah, it has to do with the IP strength and the dedication and love for the characters. I keep a very close eye on the characters that people like the most in my story.
Mm,
I have a lot of like smaller charm size keychains for other characters who aren't the main three to kind of keep track of like how fast they are selling out. So, for example, Lee, the second oldest royal brother, sold out like nearly instantly, which was a
mm,
little shocking. So I would say that he's one of the
yeah.
more popular characters. But the other three, I keep, King and Shu and our youngest prince, I keep a very close eye on them. I was very surprised to see that the youngest prince actually sells more keychains than the other two.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, but, King is second, and then Shu, of course, he'll either go with King. I think there's been a couple of people who have only bought Shu, but Shu tends to be kind of packaged in with King. So people are either like stands of, our young trans prince or they're stands of King. So I think that a lot of the success comes from the strength of people's attachments to the character. The other thing is just the frequency of my marketing. I do a lot of updates on my creator profile, which sends a notification to people who are following it saying, hey, like we restocked on this, or hey, these are selling out. Come buy them. I know that people can find push notifications to be annoying, but I've learned that the people who don't want the push notification, they will just swipe it away. They don't care. The people who do read it and they find it interesting, they will go and they'll investigate more. So I think it's okay to kind of do like a push notification maybe like once a week. And then with the updates at the very end of my comic and recent episodes since actually launching the store, I found that that's been very helpful, this call to action to go to check out the Etsy store every week. So whenever I
Mm.
update an episode and it has that CTA at the end, I do end up getting a couple of Etsy orders after the new episode goes up. So I've completely removed
Ah, I
my
see.
social media CTA to instead incorporate the Etsy CTA and divert the traffic there.
Interesting. I don't know how I feel about the fact that Lee is like selling out so quickly, but yeah, he's an interesting character at the very least. So
He
I can
he
see.
reaches a certain demographic, a certain type of fan base.
Yeah. But before we move on to like the rapid fire round, just wanted to ask you a little bit about your future. How are you thinking about your future as a creator? Are you just focused on finishing off reads? Are there other stories that you want to tell?
Yeah, REEDS, was definitely more of my experiment child. I wanted to be very scrappy with it, to learn a lot from it, so that it can make my future works better. I already have started writing novel style, the next story that I wanna do after this, which will probably come out in, like, 2025, but I've already kind of have a long-term plan of what I wanna do next, but I'm very happy with where REEDS is at, and I'm very grateful to it. There's a lot of learning that I have made from this that is going to contribute to the success of my next project.
And then in terms of just the future of webcomics, do you have any predictions or maybe things that you'd like to see?
In regards to predictions, I think that we should probably turn towards looking at the direction that Naver Webtoon and Kakao have made with their platforms, as well as looking at the mobile space in general. I think that
Mm,
scroll web comics and mobile web comics have taken a different trajectory than traditional like paper comics in that they are entering the
mm.
mobile space. So they will grow the way that mobile entertainment content will grow. So I think that's something that we need to take into consideration. And I think that that's the direction that these comics are going to be going towards because this is the model that the corporations are likely turning towards.
And then do you have any advice for like someone that's just thinking about starting their first comic?
Yeah, so you always hear the advice people say to just start and just get started and don't think too much about it. I want to kind of expand on that in saying to don't be afraid of failure. I always ascribe to the philosophy of failing forward. So you take failure and you learn from your mistakes and you move forward with it. It's pretty much a simple philosophy, but it's actually a lot harder to do in practice. Um, you always see creators who they have a lot of really large ambitions, and then they become very discouraged when they don't hit the successes that they want right away, or they're hitting a lot of failures and it becomes very demoralizing and it hurts them a lot. And I think it's normal to, be hurt and be sad and feel that kind of pain whenever you're not succeeding in the way that you want to succeed. But I think that it's important to learn the skill of accepting failure and then also learning and looking at your failures objectively, thinking back on, okay, what did I do incorrectly here that caused this outcome? Try not to put too much of your feelings into it or lash out at other people. You sometimes see people who, when they fail, they start blaming other people, they'll blame the platform or, some higher being that is like being cruel to them. I think it's better to kind of step away from that once you can kind of process those feelings and take observations on what went wrong. So like, oh, maybe I timed the release of this post wrong. I'm marketing to the wrong demographic. I'm looking at like, the stats from a different angle, that kind of stuff. So I ascribe to fail forward. So if you fail, you should take it as a learning opportunity and then move forward.
I love it. And like you said, very hard to do. I would love to take a lesson from your book. So thanks for sharing that. Let's close out with the rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Which fictional character best describes your personality?
I would say Edna Mode from The Incredibles, the little like fashion designer. Aside from the fact that I myself love fashion and I love the practicality of fashion, I think a lot about this quote that comes from her. I never look back, it distracts from the now. And that's something that I try to describe in everything that I do. So
Mm,
like, I'll look back and I can look at like my old comic episodes and be like, oh, like it looks terrible. But I have no desire to redraw any of them or redo any of them. I just keep moving forward because, it's only getting better and I don't want to distract myself from doing that stuff. The other thing too is how she uh tried to change the way that she designed superhero capes. So she doesn't do capes
yeah,
anymore.
I was gonna bring
Yeah.
up the capes.
Yeah, she doesn't do capes anymore because again, she's failing forward. She learned from her mistakes and now she's just moving on and choosing other solutions to that.
Which three comics would you take with you on a desert island?
The first one would be Wayne Family Adventures. I've always loved Batman as character, but he's had a lot of really dark stories. So I very much enjoy this newer, fresher slice of life take on the Batman universe instead of it being so full of pain and trauma. It's about healing and family, and Bruce Wayne actually being happy, which is something that I didn't realize that we needed in this IP, but it's pretty great. The other one would be Berserk. I really love not only just the attention to detail in Berserk, but also the themes of finding beauty and love within a painful, like dark world and seeing Guts' growth through that. The other one would be One Piece because it's still going. It's very long. I have never read One Piece. If I'm stuck on a desert island, I want to have something to keep me entertained. So I will read One Piece for the first time.
If you could pick any, which creator would you want to have dinner with?
Okay, so his name is really difficult to pronounce, and he purposely doesn't tell people how to pronounce it because he likes watching people struggle pronouncing it. He's the Croatian comic artist who did Sunstone and Harleen. I'm gonna try really hard to pronounce his name. Stepan Sage, I think. The way that he does his paintings and he renders things at the rate and the pace that he does it is so fascinating to me. I would love to just kind of pick his brain and understand his process, as well as the way that he does storytelling and he balances humor and serious moments so well. So I would love to just sit down with him and just kind of learn more about how his brain is wired and how his creativity is wired. And I'd also love if his wife Linda could be there too, because she is also just as talented and she's a very great person. I love just seeing her on my feed all the time.
What's your favorite scene from any comic?
The most poignant scene from any comic that I have ever witnessed in my entire life was in Tokyo Ghoul. The main character, Kaneki Ken, his best friend Hide, who's kind of been silently observing him go through a really difficult, traumatic time throughout the story, is talking to another character and explaining, like, oh, Kaneki, the main character, hides a lot of himself and he doesn't talk about it. And you'll know because he has a tell where if he's lying, he touches his chin and he shows the motion of touching his chin. And that was really mind blowing to me because when you go back and you read the previous volumes, he does that a lot. And you start to see like, oh,
Mm,
like, the author was like showing this and foreshadowing this a lot throughout the entire story. All the instances where he's lying or he's uncomfortable, he's touching his chin. So that
Wow.
was mind blowing, and that taught me to use visual tells. Again, I love visual storytelling. I've learned a lot about visual cues and also giving characters fidgets. My characters also have their own fidgets whenever they're in certain situations.
And then finally, if you could have dinner with a fictional character, who would it be?
It would be El Elliot from Death Note because it would have a lot of sweets, and I love sweets. So I would love to just hang out and eat sweets with this guy.
Izzy, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been a lot of fun to learn more about Reeds. Listener, please check out Reeds on Webtoon. From there, you can find Izzy's creator profile and find all of his socials. Izzy, it's been an absolute blast, and thanks for coming on the show.
It's been great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any feedback or want to be featured as our next guest, please write to us at pixelsandpanelspod@gmail.com. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe, like, or give us a 5-star rating. See you all next week.